Hi, and welcome to tonight's podcast in the CommieCast series. The Communist Party is a working class party. Our members are working class and they live as parents, volunteers, professional, and workers in the local communities where many of them are extremely active trying to improve conditions. Now, as with all of us in this country, we come up against the issue of crime at some point, and the party's developed radical and public sector led answers to dealing with it. Our answer is to build and, where necessary, rebuild communities to seek to undermine the conditions that give rise to crime. But of course, it's more than just a question of resources. And in some communities, antisocial behaviour, racist, sexist, and ageist attitudes lead to crime. Today, we're going to discuss what can be done to undermine this crime, but also how we can deal with it effectively when and where it occurs, and how can we rebuild communities, including the rehabilitation of many of those who have transgressed. Our speakers tonight are Robert Griffiths, who has been in prison, but has also worked for NACRO, the largest criminal justice organisation in England and Wales. Robert is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, so therefore he's my boss, and I shall treat him with the due respect. We also have Mark Ewington, who's been an active trade unionist throughout his working life and has been a probation officer for 2 decades, working with those who are within the criminal justice system. Now, he knows how to tackle gang crime and get people out of this dead end. Mark will be standing in the May 2022 local elections as a Communist Party candidate in St Albans. Mark is not my boss, but I shall still treat him with the necessary respect. Comrades, thank you very much for turning up here. The first question, I'm going to put this over to you, Robert. How big an issue do you think crime is, and how does it affect working class people?
Well, I think even before I answer that, Stewart, I think it's only fair I point out that I've spent periods on remand in prison for politically related offences. No, how important is crime and how does it affect working class people, I think, is the question. And the reality to anybody who has spent any time living in the midst of working class communities. I was brought up on one of the biggest, if not the biggest, council estate in Wales, in Cardiff. It's got a bit of a bad reputation these days, but I don't remember my time there in that way. And until recently, I've lived in areas in Cardiff such as Cathays and Splot. I'm well aware that for many people, crime is a distressing feature of life in those communities. And of course, for people who are just always trying to just get on with their lives and do the right thing and so on, it can blight people's lives and it can blight whole communities. I would broaden that to say crime and antisocial behaviour in particular can do that. And I'm afraid the left has got a reputation, not always completely deserved, but it's got a reputation of largely seeking to avoid this issue. And yet there's only one thing we can do, in my view, and that's to confront it head on. People are very concerned about crime and antisocial behaviour. And it creates huge problems and sometimes, of course, terrible tragedies in working class communities and beyond. So it is a big issue. It is a big issue. And although the Communist Party, I don't think, has run away from it, I still think we need to give it the seriousness, we need to give it the serious attention that it requires.
Yeah, exactly. We do have the reputation of being soft on crime, but many of the victims of crime, probably most of the victims of crime, are working people. And it's something which I feel very strongly about. We need to defend our people in every possible way. Mark, over to you. Can you please answer the same questions and give you a perspective there, please, comrade?
Yes, when people generally join, for argument's sake, the criminal justice system, they are well furnished, shall we say, in rational choice theory. I think in some of these situations, that rational choice, as many people would put it, is limited and often taken away from a lot of people as a result of social conditions, as a result of social exclusion, as a result of lack of educational opportunities, as a result of the lack of investment in youth services, for instance. Clearly, in our document, The Britain's Road for Socialism, particularly in chapters 5 and 6, where we're talking quite a lot about society building, criminal justice, and social justice. I think these are common sense approaches to addressing the issues of crime. And clearly, whilst it isn't just about funding, it is about making sure that we enable and support people in shifting attitudes and perspectives as well. As I said at the top of what I was saying, a rational choice has been taken away from a lot of people that are drawn into crime at a young age, that end up getting involved in gangs, in knife crime, in being drawn into drugs, in being drawn into alcohol, in being victims of domestic abuse, etc. There are many solutions that I think that we have, and I think we need to start with the mindset that this can be addressed, and it can be addressed with practical solutions. A lot of what we're talking about here absolutely is not rocket science, and as I say, we have many solutions when we think about our social policies, when we think about housing, education, employment, how youth are sometimes excluded from that and sometimes labelled. Often, as a young child, if the education system has been difficult for them and they're labelled, it's easier to become the label than it is to be something other than the label. And for people to be other than the labels that are often attached to them, they need to be supported in the community.
Very interesting points. So this takes me on nicely to my next couple of questions here. Robert, is crime inevitable? And is there a difference between, say, the crimes of a corrupt government and street crime?
I'm afraid there is a certain inevitability about various types of criminal behaviour, given the fundamental character of the society in which we live. If it's a society in which greed is rewarded, in which selfishness pays off, in which people can exploit other people, in which there's gross inequality, in which essential services and means of support for people are lacking, then I'm afraid it's all too easy for crime to thrive. I'd have to say, of course, that in societies where some measure of social justice is achieved, with high standards of education and health and so on, where people are respected and encouraged and supported, then we do see a relationship between that and the low level of crime and antisocial behaviour that exists there. Even today, if we consider countries with a socialist orientated government and system, and for that matter with communist governments, whether it's Cuba or Vietnam or China, levels of crime and antisocial behavior are significantly lower than we find them in our Western capitalist societies, where greed and exploitation are actually rewarded and are part of the official ideology of the state. And again, just relating to your previous question, Stewart, the communist governments have never been accused of being soft on crime. Having said that, the main way in which they managed to reduce levels of crime and antisocial behavior is by striving to give people a better health service, better education service, jobs, social recognition, greater respect, and this undoubtedly has an impact in terms of reducing crime. A corrupt government sets the wrong example, it sends all the wrong signals, and of course a government that is so corrupt that it's more concerned with lining the pockets of its own members and filling the bank accounts of its big business sponsors is not going to be a government that gives the correct priorities to these questions of social justice, health, education, employment, social facilities, and so on.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, comrade. Okay, Mark, you're on the same topic.
Yes, in my opinion, crime is absolutely inevitable in a capitalist society. There's no two ways around that. I think we've talked already about social exclusion, how institutions will label people, how those very institutions that label people, including the education system, will often be there to not enable people at all, but to almost for people to, be in a certain position. And as I say, that struggle to move forwards with the adequate support that Robert has talked about is absolutely essential in terms of funding, in terms of enabling people to move forwards, and to do that with some confidence. In terms of the government linked into this, when I was doing my research for this evening, obviously I was looking at a bit of about white collar crime. If we listen to some of the underpinning themes of some of this: peer support, corporate culture, lack of accountability, lack of reporting, a fragile political system, as Rob's already touched on, greed, personal gain, opportunities to commit crime, situational pressure, people believing that they are invincible because of their success. That sounds like a resume for front bench politicians, in my opinion. And I think that's where we are as far as that's concerned. Now, clearly, as we've already said, programs need to be properly funded, but we also need to distinguish between those that enforce law and those that make the law. For argument's sake, and I guess we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, drug laws are an absolute joke. They do not work. They criminalise people that can be managed in other ways, that can be diverted away from the criminal justice system altogether in some cases, and be supported for properly funded projects that will enable people to use drugs safely, but also to wean themselves away from drugs with the proper support regarding education, employment, training, opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that. I got something earlier on this evening because I'm all about the fun from a Spanish statistical service. And it showed the 12 most crime-ridden and murder-ridden cities in Latin America, 10 of which were in Mexico. Now, Mexico is a relatively well-off country by Latin American standards. There is a lot of poverty there. But it's a country which has been, to a large extent, destroyed by the American appetite for drugs and by the drug laws which are operational there. But we'll come on to this a little bit later. Rob, how do you think communities can create conditions whereby crime is reduced? And say, can they deal with the drug use issues that Mark was talking about there?
I'll just answer that by coming at it in a different way. If we're talking about creating the conditions in which crime is reduced, we've got to stop creating the conditions in which crime is increased. I remember the huge impact that the return of mass unemployment in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and for that matter, ever since, the impact that had on many working class communities was disastrous. A huge and a rapid rise in drug addiction and all of the criminal behavior and antisocial behavior that goes with that. So we've got to stop the policies that actually create the conditions, the poor housing, the social deprivation, the feeling that people are in dead-end communities, the lack of investment in schools, in proper jobs, in training, and so on, in rehabilitation, in helping people who've become addicted to drugs, in tackling problems of alcoholism and so on. So there are lots of things that can be done. Some of the measures are quite simple. Of course, you create fewer opportunities for crime to take place by having proper lighting systems on council estates and in built-up areas and so on. The lights in the street lights just outside my house here are due to go off quite soon, and the place will be plunged into darkness, or at best semi-darkness. So there has to be investment in communities. It does come back to money sometimes. And as an Iron Bevan used to say, socialism, the language of socialism is the religion of priorities, or it might have been the other way around. It's a question of priorities. Are we taxing those who can afford to pay much more tax? Are we then investing those increased revenues in local communities, in drug rehabilitation, in making our streets safe, and so on? In a probation system and a prison system that can be effective and serves the interests of the wider community. That's the big failure in our society, I believe, that the priorities of those who rule us are all completely wrong. And of course, the reality is that most of the very rich, almost all the very rich, and almost all of those who have real power in our society don't live in these communities where crime and antisocial behavior is a reality for those who do have to live in them.
Exactly, yeah. Down here in South East London, when you look at Woolwich, we've now got more or less 100% social apartheid. In Woolwich, the fancy new bits by the river are more or less completely separated and gated from regular Woolwich, which is back in the inland area. And people live close to each other, but they know nothing about the lives of people who live in one of the poorer parts of town. Mark, what do you think we can do about this?
Well, education is key right across the board. In addition to proper funding of the things that we've already talked about, education is absolutely key. If you think about things like this, it's a statistic that has not gone away, regardless of how much money has been thrown at it or not. 2 women are killed per week by a partner or by an ex-partner as a result of domestic abuse, as a result of stalking, as a result of power and control within relationships. It's occurred to me there is a very straightforward solution to some of this, and that's to start educating people about relationship skills, perhaps at the age of 13, 14 years old when they're at school. There'll be an awful lot of things that people are learning at school. I mean, I don't know about yourselves, but since I left school, I've not seen or touched a Bunsen burner once. Had some people been given the opportunity to develop their relationship skills at an early age, we might be able to address this fundamental problem that occurs in society right across society. And I think with education, with focus, etc., we can improve the quality of our individual relationships, of our intimate relationships, etc. That would be one example that I think would be a straightforward way of addressing a social problem that needs a coordinated approach. Again, where there's diversion could take place. At the point people are arrested, there can be a full assessment of a person's needs. Then sometimes that might mean that people don't have to come to court if they are matched to the right resources. Now, sometimes there's a gap between theory and practice. The theory of people and organisations working together to help and support somebody is very different from the reality of the situation. If I might give a couple of examples of that. I've recently worked in a prison in the south of England during the COVID pandemic. It was a progressive prison, allegedly progressive, I should say. Category C prison. Prisoners were behind the door 22 hours a day. There was no health, no education, no rehabilitation programs being offered. That was extended for a long period of time, and that wasn't extended because people couldn't socialise anymore because of the pandemic. It was because there was short-staffed. When people realised that the wings were only being managed by 2 or 3 prison officers, for instance, the reality of why people were behind the door 22 hours a day had little to do with COVID in the end, and everything to do with the fact that of underfunding of those services, and how you rehabilitate people without that education, without those programs, etc. It is beyond me. So people will leave prison often without the right support. They will leave without being more likely even to go on to commit further offences because they've been let down at the very point they should have been able to access services that will assist them.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mark. Rob, you wanted to come back on something here.
Well, Mark went right to the heart of things when he talked about the central role of education. I mean, I was the head of a basic education centre for NACRO, and I visited many prisoners before they were due for release, and I met many probation clients. And I must admit, I didn't realise the extent to which so many people who've got themselves into offending and antisocial behaviour, so many of them have such enormous problems of literacy and numeracy, very, very low educational attainment. And that's why we put on basic education classes to try and assist them in that. And actually, many of them, very low self-esteem. The popular image that's projected in the tabloids and so on are that, you know, there is a criminal type and they're loud and aggressive and they're thuggish and so on. I'm afraid that stereotype simply does not apply to many, many people who are engaged in crime and antisocial behaviour and who are therefore caught up in the criminal justice system. They are lacking self-esteem. They were told that they were probably, many of them do come from very difficult family circumstances. At school, they were told they were failures. They were told that they were never going to get anywhere. They were labelled, and that's how they've grown up to see themselves. And we have got to really put in serious investment in order to tackle that. The other important issue that Mark raised, of course, was the blight of violence against women in our society. And again, education from a young age has an important, vital role to play in combating the kind of attitudes whereby some people, quite a few people, believe that the mistreatment of women, treating women and girls without respect, inflicting violence upon them is utterly unacceptable in a civilized society that aspires to be a fair society. And where we haven't been able to prevent domestic violence, what do we do for so many of the victims of domestic violence? We simply don't invest in the facilities that they need. Women's refuges around Britain are constantly having to scramble and beg and borrow money to fund the most basic facilities for women who can no longer live in their homes along with their children. It's unsafe for them. For women and children, they have to find refuge. And every part of Britain should have the most modern, up-to-date, open and welcoming facilities for women and children who are victims of male violence.
Thank you very much, Rob. Right, so the police. Tell me, what role do you think the police have in this, Rob?
Well, clearly there's a very, very important role for the right kind of policing. And I don't think, by the way, knee-jerk reactions that we get from some quarters, of the left are very helpful here. Many police officers, in my experience, I've been on the wrong end of a few, by the way, but many police officers, in my experience, go into the job with the best of intentions. They want to perform a public service. They want to help their communities and so on. Perhaps I've been lucky. That's been my experience. It becomes increasingly difficult for them to hang on to those ideals, as they remain in a job that is a very difficult job. It is a dangerous job. And quite honestly, everything is stacked against them in terms of the kind of circumstances in which they're trying to do their job. So I don't start from the premise that the police are the enemy. Of course, there are rogue police officers around, and I've met more than my fair share of those as well. But we have to create the conditions in which we can have the right kind of policing that's effective. And that means that policing must be very close to the communities in which police officers operate. There have to be real links between the police and members of those communities, including elected representatives and so on. I don't think we resolve these very deep problems with gimmicks such as police and crime commissioners. Some of them have done their best. Others, it's just a reward for being a long-serving councillor or an MP. And others are stood as a joke. So I don't think there's been no magic golden key to solving the problems of policing. What we need is policing that is responsive and accountable, for that matter, to the communities in which they operate. And there are problems. Of course, there are questions of police recruitment, police training, and so on. But more than anything else, we need to start changing the whole society in which police officers, those who are doing a responsible and socially conscious job.
Yeah, I don't like this knee-jerk reaction on some parts of the left to hate all the police. I've trained a number of police officers over the years, and like any organisation, there are some good, some bad. The vast majority of them have been good people who want to do their best. Mark, you've also had contact with the police a lot over the years. What's your view on this question?
Yes, I work with the police on a regular basis. I do have to say sometimes I think it's important to distinguish between the lawmaker and the law enforcer, because when bad laws are made, sometimes it's difficult to get for the police to be able to manage those laws and apply the law in a way that's reasonable and fair based on the inequalities of the criminal justice system. I think policing, personally, for me, the police should absolutely be around the table all the time when we're talking about rehabilitation, because often people's first taste of the criminal justice system will be when they're picked up by the police and sometimes arrested. As I said earlier, I think there should be more focus on diverting people from the criminal justice system based on some of the needs they may have. For instance, if they have drug issues, if they have alcohol issues, if there's mental health problems that have either been undiagnosed or haven't been properly assessed and managed because of the holes within the system and the way that it's meant to work. Clearly, within the probation service, what we used to write was social inquiry reports, which we now call pre-sentence reports. That looks at what underpins the offending behaviour. It looks at the offence, but crucially, it looks at the needs that people will have, whether that be, again, around drugs, alcohol, housing, mental health, emotional well-being, all of these things. It's a shame to me that people sometimes have to come into the court system before that assessment takes place. In an ideal world, I think that assessment could probably take place at the point of arrest, so people could be diverted away from the criminal justice system into services that they will need to help them reduce their risk of reconviction in the future. Now, again, that will require money. It will require a different approach, a different way of thinking, but it will be absolutely crucial in directing people to the services that they may need, that they may have been excluded from.
Right, that's an interesting point. I want to raise this as well. Mark, you can expand on this in a couple of minutes. Rob, back to you. Once a crime has been committed, how should we deal with the criminal? Do we lock them up and throw away the key, as many would say?
Well, a lot depends on the crime, and a lot depends on the nature and the background and the upbringing and the disposition of the criminal. Clearly, there are people whose behaviour is such that society has to be protected from them, and they have to be taken away from the normal living and working conditions that most of us experience. It's simply not safe for people to have such criminals, in their communities. And sometimes, in terms of some of the criminality that we do see, I do think there is a case sometimes for saying the sentences are too light. For me, violence, especially unprovoked violence, casual violence, is one of the most despicable forms of criminal and antisocial behavior. And yet you see them receiving, less prison time than people who've committed non-violent offences. Now, I know there's still victims when non-violent offences are committed, but it does seem to me sometimes the balance is wrong. 50% of people in prison in Britain at this moment are not in prison for violent behaviour. Now, of the remaining 49%, over half of those are in for violent offences, and society does need to be protected from them, sometimes for very long periods of time. But others are in for sexual offences, and clearly may or may not involve violence and coercion, and clearly, they have to be people have to be safeguarded from them. But so many others are in for drug offences, not for violence connected with drug offences, but for drug offences. There are other ways in which we must be trying to combat this huge problem of drug abuse in Britain. And simply branding everybody who uses drugs or sells a small amount of their own stash so they can get a bit more money to buy some more, simply branding them as criminals who have to be locked up, is not working. And there are many others who are in prison for non-payment of fines and for other acts where clearly prison is not the way to deal with this. Our prisons are overcrowded. They've been overcrowded for the 50 years and more that I've been active in community politics and in the Communist Party and so on. We can't build them fast enough, and we still have many old prisons, of course, that if they were housing anybody else, they would have been pulled down as unfit for human habitation decades ago. We can't just keep building more and more prisons. We have to deal with criminals in a much more flexible way. Yes, there are those that have to be taken and kept apart from decent and civilized human beings. And even then, there are possibly avenues whereby we can help to at least understand so that we can combat their behavior, if not in themselves, then how others might be prone to commit that kind of vicious activity in the future. But there are so many others where we can find much more constructive ways of enabling them to stay in our society and to start to make a more positive contribution to our community. Prison rehabilitation, I have direct experience of this, despite the efforts of many decent prison officers, I have to say. But prison as a venue for rehabilitation is a complete and utter farce and a joke. It's a confidence trick being placed on people. We're sending many prisoners out in many ways worse in terms of their ability and their tendency to engage in criminal activity, worse than when they went in. That's the reality.
Yes, I understand that completely, and I can recognise that in a few people I've known over the years too. Mark, I can see you nodding your head vigorously there. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, I agree with everything Robert has just said. That is absolutely the system. He's described the system, the exact system that I'm working within. I do agree that there is a small group of people that will need to be in custody for the protection of the public. However, as we've talked about, for low-level crime, people that might be assessed to be low, sometimes medium risk, for low and medium risk crimes. If we think about this, sometimes for the possession of cannabis, for the possession, as Robert has said, for slightly more drugs than may be acceptable to some, you have to get that person arrested, charged, taken to court, adjourned to the court, take up to complete a pre-sentence report, possibly another adjournment, and then sentenced. A majority of people in those circumstances, if we looked at drug laws again and had a sensible approach to drug laws, would not have to come to the criminal justice system at all. That process takes time. It clogs up the system. It means the police are spending their time often bringing people to court that they could have otherwise dealt with, meaning that they cannot focus on the people they need to be focusing on. One, to protect the public, but two, to ensure that people get the opportunities that they need. As I said to you before, it's for me, it's all about diversion at the correct point, and it will reduce the amount of people that would need to be processed by the criminal justice system and labelled by that system at all.
Mark, Do you think that the Portuguese experiment regarding decriminalisation of drugs and treating drug abuse like it's an illness gives us a good example of what can and should be done?
I think absolutely projects like that can absolutely be like that. I think there are very clear things. First of all, if people are going to be using drugs, they need to be using them safely. There needs to be needle exchanges. There also needs to be safe places to be able to be able to use those drugs. Clearly, that's not a position that's going to be sustainable for a lot of people. But it also means that if people aren't being criminalised because of addictions, and as you say, because if you look at it as an illness, then again it takes people out the system. Alongside that, there needs to be all of the things that we've already talked about: education, support, housing, training opportunities. People feel that they need to have a chance, and as they start their recovery, they can continue their recovery by seeing the benefits of that recovery if there's a proper system supporting them moving forward. So absolutely, projects like that, projects like the Edinburgh system, I think we really need to have a look at these projects again, because we're not going to eradicate drug use. If people are going to use drugs, they need to do it safely, and they need to be on proper programs that enable support, that enable that trust to be built, to be able to get all of the things that they will need to live a life in the future that might not need drugs. Now, sometimes that might mean, as we've talked about before, complex backgrounds, etc., where there might be other issues that have been masked by drug use, etc. Particularly what we find in the criminal justice system at the moment is there are lots of people with undiagnosed mental health problems that have been self-medicating. Then they cannot be seen and properly assessed by mental health services. It's those mental health services that are crucial in picking these things up, and it's really important that we work in a joined up system. The reality is, when cases are complex, people in real terms, apart from the critical few, are protecting their own pots of money and not working in collaboration in the interest of the people they're supposed to be helping.
Okay, Rob, any views on that one?
Yeah, there's a world of difference between the victims of drug abuse, between those who might deal a little bit in cannabis and so on a small scale. There's a world of difference between the addicts on the one side and the organized, violent criminal gangs who prey upon working class people and working class communities. And I think the position of the Communist Party in Britain is like that of communists across the world. As far as we are concerned, all the forces of the state should be mobilized to smash these gangs. They don't exist under socialist governments. And in Britain, I think, our party and our programme, Britain's Road to Socialism, makes clear we would use the full power of the state to smash these vicious, organised criminal gangs who do so much to harm our local communities.
We have talked a lot about drugs tonight, and this probably takes us on quite seamlessly into our last topic. America has got a prison population larger than the population of the 89 smallest countries in the United Nations. And also, America comprises about 4.4% of the world's population, but it has 22% of the world's prison population living inside its borders. Now, a large part of this will be down to their criminal policies regarding drug addiction or people taking drugs. And also the prison service is run as a private business in many states. Rob, how do you think crime prevention, containment and rehabilitation should be organised in Britain? And I'm guessing you won't be recommending we take on the American model.
Well, what the statistics you've just given us, Stewart, shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, America is the homeland of turbocharged capitalism, of grotesque inequality, where the unofficial state religion appears to be the worship of violence. So many of their TV programs and so many of their public and social activities revolve around violence in one form or another. Not surprising. Now, unfortunately, Britain is also still one of the major capitalist powers in the world, and certainly one of the oldest. And we do need to look to America because they are tackling problems that they may be on a bigger scale, but they're problems we have here as a developed and grotesquely unequal capitalist society. But we need to look to America not only to see if they've got some good ideas and some good practices. I think we can also look to the United States in order to learn how not to do things. How not to do things includes the privatization of the prison service, privatization of probation services. Of course, that's been tried in Britain and has been so far a total and utter failure that even right-wing governments have had to try and row back from a little bit. Dealing with crime and antisocial behavior should never be about profit. And should never involve those agencies, those companies and the rest of it, who are in it primarily for the money. And who look to cut costs and look to try and very often to try and screw as much public money as they can out of public authorities. It's completely the wrong approach. And therefore, all of our prison service ought to be brought back into public ownership. It shouldn't be about penny pinching. It shouldn't be about profits for shareholders. We need to be organizing our agencies that seek to combat crime and antisocial behavior on the basis of what our society needs, what local communities need, not on what will maximize profit for private business.
Thank you. Mark, I imagine you have some very strong views on this.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with everything that Robert has said. In terms of where we are here, even, in my view, the private sector has no place in the criminal justice system. In my opinion, the fact is that you've heard about how prisons are not working at the moment, how mixed economies have been introduced into prisons where people are protecting their pots of money, and the inevitable consequence of that is when people are protecting pots of money, those that need the services most aren't getting those services and often being refused access to those services on the basis they haven't been drug free or alcohol free for a period of time where they need those services to be able to move forwards. It's a real farce. There is one victory that a lot of people probably didn't get to know about at the time, and as a member of the National Association of Probation Officers, was very actively involved in seeking to prevent the privatisation of 70% of the probation service. That was in 2013 under Transforming Rehabilitation. Now, what happened was a number of private sector companies who have no understanding of complex needs or the criminal justice system were handed out contracts. The money kept rolling in because the government didn't want the private sector to fail in the criminal justice system, and it absolutely did. Well, a couple of years ago, it was accepted that the Transform and Rehabilitation agenda was an absolute farce, and reluctantly, the government renationalised the probation service. So where we are at now is the probation service is coming back together. Now, it's easy to smash a cup into 100 pieces. It's not quite so easy to glue it back together again. And when you had a two-tier system, what that basically meant was that some service users were getting managed appropriately, getting different access to funding, etc. Whereas other service users weren't getting any of those things at all. It was like the shop window. Once you get inside the shop, there's nothing on the shelves. So what I would say is strongly that the private sector has done nothing to improve the criminal justice system at all. Indeed, one of the companies that got some contracts in the east of England, their only resume was that they'd provided previous sandwich contracts previously from the Ministry of Defence. That does not qualify an organisation to be able to run a organisation which has basically got people with complex needs at the heart of that. Basically, these contracts went to the lowest bidder that saw people as units rather than as individuals with issues that needed to be addressed. It's almost as if again, we've seen a lot. We've seen a lot in recent times about contracts going into the government's mates, and I think this is another example of that. It was an absolute failure. We actually won this. Not very many people know that we won this, and we didn't get the publicity we should have. But the private sector is now no longer present within the probation service again, having sought it to focus on 70% of that service. It was a complete disaster. The government wasted a lot of taxpayers' money, and now they reluctantly accept that the experts here are the people that are working with people for the right reasons, not for a profit motive.
Like many things which have happened over the last, since 2010, whenever the Tories got in, you really couldn't make this up. Right, we need to draw to an end now. Thank you both very much indeed. I'm pretty sure we shall return to this topic because it's opened up a hell of a lot of issues. To close here, just to go ahead and give some figures to substantiate what Rob in particular was talking about. Regarding inequality and crime in the States, where most of the good research has taken place, over a 20-year period, a couple of guys at universities of Oklahoma and University of California in Berkeley demonstrated that the American states that had the greatest inequality in visible expenditure, spending on items like clothing, jewelry, cars, and eating out, so the most visible and gross inequality, also suffered the most from violent crime. And another long-term study in the States between 1974 and 2000 showed that for basically a 1% increase in unemployment, and this was across 49 states, so pretty much all of America, led to a 4% increase in crime. Furthermore, 33% of the change in property crimes over this period could be attributed to unemployment. So we can talk about various mechanisms we can adopt to go ahead and deal with crime, but we want to go ahead and deal with crime and stop it properly. We have to create a more equitable and fair society and an economy which works for everybody. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. This has been CommieCast. We are anti-fascist, we are anti-racist, but we are very much for the working class. See you next time. Cheers.